We've heard a lot in recent months about police and the relationships between law enforcement and minorities. This is true in North Carolina and across the country. And in this segment, we're going to talk about how one Western state has tackled this topic. We're getting help from John Cooke, Assistant Minority Leader of the Colorado State Senate. And if the last name sounds familiar, yes, he is the husband of the John Locke Foundation's CEO, Amy Cooke. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mitch. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you in the state senate and in the legislature in general in Colorado took a look at this issue of accountability and police and law enforcement and its relationships with the community. When this legislation started, you had some real concerns. Tell us about those.
Oh, I had a lot of concerns, and because of my background, I did 30 years at the Weld County Sheriff's Office. The last is the last 12 years as the elected sheriff. So I looked at this bill, and I had a lot of concerns. I called it the revenge bill. I called it a punishment, punish the police bill. I even said, it's like I called it to some of my friends, it's like F the police bill. And so I had a lot of concerns because it really did punish law enforcement and punish victims of crime in a very serious way. So a lot of concerns with the bill.
What were some of the problems with the bill that made it so concerning to you?
Well, the bill was 40 pages, and so there were a lot of issues. But some of them, when it came to the victims, you had to have a body cam on the entire time. You were not allowed to turn it off. So every officer had to have a body cam on. Well, the problem with that is if an officer gets called to a sexual assault on a child, and they walk in, and there's a naked child there, or there's a bloody scene of some kind, you could not redact it. You were not allowed to redact anything from the body cam, and it had to be released within 7 days to the public and to the media, and that was a huge problem for victims' rights for privacy protection of victims and children. So that was one of the big issues. The other is, like I said, the body cams had to be on the entire time. So what if the officer had to go to the restroom? He was not allowed to turn it off, and if there was, it was a criminal penalty for turning off the body cam. They wanted to do away with the good faith exception for law enforcement and the qualified immunity. I wasn't too concerned about the qualified immunity, but the good faith exception I was going to die on my hill for because law enforcement operates on good faith every day by what victims or witnesses tell them, and they're operating on good faith. And if a witness tells an officer something and the officer makes an arrest based on that good faith and it turns out to be wrong, then the officer could be sued up to $100,000, not allowed to have insurance, and the city could not indemnify him. So it was really punishing the officer on the street for operating, like I said, under good faith. The qualified immunity, a lot of people misunderstand that, and especially in law enforcement. If you intentionally violate somebody's civil rights, you're not going to get qualified immunity anyway. You're going to be sitting in federal court under a 1983 civil rights action, and you're not going to get qualified immunity. So wasn't really too upset about that. Those were two of the main points of the bill, but there were, like I said, there were so many issues in that bill that there was no way I could support it in committee or on the floor as it was written.
We're chatting with Senator John Cooke of the Colorado State Senate, and as we mentioned, he is the husband of the John Locke Foundation's CEO, Amy Cooke. Do you think that the problems with this bill were all because they were out to punish the police, or was it a case of people who just didn't really have the background in law enforcement that you did and didn't realize there were going to be these problems?
I think a little bit of both, and I think the way it started, with the incident up in Minneapolis, and it was like legislatures, are knee-jerk bodies. It's like, oh, something happened over here, we have to do something about it now. And so this bill was pretty much ramrodded through, and the ACLU, who's one of the main authors of the bill with the legislators, they admitted they just threw everything up on the wall to see what would stick. And they wanted free flowing ideas from their people. And so they just threw everything up and came up with this bill that was just horrendous.
Well, we mentioned that the bill as it stood was a problem. You were not going to vote for it as it was originally introduced. It ended up passing your Senate 32-1, got through the whole legislature, got signed into law. What happened to make it an acceptable and very acceptable bill?
Well, what happened was in committee, I was put on the State Affairs Committee because of my background in law enforcement. The minority leader took the two Republicans off and put myself and another Republican on that is an attorney. And so he understands, the laws and understood the gravity of the situation. And we started picking the bill apart in committee with the bill sponsors. And I'll be quite frank, I don't think the bill sponsors even knew what was in the bill. They didn't understand it because we were starting to ask questions. We were taking it piece by piece by piece of the bill sponsors. And after about an hour, the committee chair said, well, we're not going to take any more questions for the bill sponsors. We're going to go straight to witnesses now. I've never in my 6 years down there ever seen that happen. I feel we have a right as senators to ask the bill sponsors questions, and he cut that off. And so then we went into witness testimony, and we probably had about, I think 4 to 5 hours of witness testimony. And at the end, I said, this is a horrible bill, and I'd like to see some changes and maybe have something I can support on second and third readings. Well, the next day, the two Republican senators of the bill sponsors came to me and said, work with us. What do you guys want? What do you and Bob want? So we sat down with them for a couple hours and gave them some ideas. The next day, which was a Saturday, we sat down with them again for another 2 hours and said, this is what you need to do. We need to have amendments to do this, take this in, take this out, put this in, rewrite this whole section. And pretty much they did everything we asked. They wrote amendments that covered all of our issues. And we got them in on second readings and then on third readings, so we voted on it. Went to the House, and the process started all over again. And in committee, in the House, they put on some more amendments, and then the House sponsors came to Senator Gardner and myself and said, what do you guys think? And we sat down with them for a couple hours and said, take this out, redo this, and add this. And they did. They did everything that we asked. And so when they came back, it was pretty much rewritten, a totally 100% rewritten bill. Now, it's not perfect by any means, but it was something that we could support because every Senate Republican was opposed to the bill as written, and they needed Republican votes because some of the Democrats were getting a lot of pressure from their sheriffs, and they knew how bad it was. So they needed us, and so they worked with us, and we got the bill to an acceptable place.
So this is a Democratic-led Senate. We mentioned that you're the assistant minority leader. They could have tried to ram this through with just Democratic votes. How does this speak to the process that you were able to, as a minority, as a Republican in a Democrat-led Senate, get changes that would lead to a good bill?
Well, again, this being an election year didn't hurt because some of the Democrat senators and some of the reps represent more moderate counties, and so the sheriffs of those counties started calling their state senators, and they sat down with them and explained for a couple of hours and said, this is what this bill does. And several of the Democrats came to me and said, I had no idea how bad this bill was. Even though they put their name on it as co-sponsors at the very beginning, they would come and say, I had no idea how bad this bill was, and I can't support this as written. And so they needed us because if they would have ramrodded it through, those up for election in some of those more moderate counties, like Jefferson County, would have been in trouble. And they knew that we would use it as an election piece against them.
This bill you mentioned earlier is not a perfect one, but what does it do that's good?
Well, it requires – I'm a big proponent of body cams because I think body cams exonerate law enforcement more than it does indict them. And so it requires every agency to eventually have body cameras. And it worked out a system where the footage can be redacted, and it also sets up a grant fund for the agencies that can't afford it to buy the body cams. And the most expensive part about body cameras is the storage. It's not the body cam. Some of the vendors were giving body cameras away for free if you use their system because the storage is so expensive. So it has a pathway for law enforcement agencies to get the body cams. And, I think it does. It shows that law enforcement is willing to work with the communities in that the Chiefs of Police Association, the Sheriff's Association, and the DA's Association in the final version all came out and supported the bill. And so I think the message is, hey, look, law enforcement, we're here. We want to work with our communities. We want to work with the legislature, and we're going to support these changes because we recognize the fact that even though this stuff happened up in Minnesota, we don't want it happening here. So I think it sends a broad message.
Are there other things that still need to be done on this front?
Yes. So what happened was the bill sponsors did not include the state patrol in any of the bill. It only included counties and cities, and we said, hey, that's not right. That it's either a law enforcement reform bill or it's not. And the reason they didn't was because the fiscal note would have been so high, and we had to cut $3 billion out of our budget this year, and the fiscal note for including the state employees would have been astronomical. It would have been like $50 million or something like that. So we then said, no, we're going to expose this, and we added the state patrol in everything except for the liability issue. And so we're going to go back and add the state patrol this year on liability. I think what the Democrats are going to try and make it a little harder again for law enforcement on what they're going to call a cleanup bill, because what they're doing is the city of Greenwood Village said, okay, we're going to indemnify all of our officers up front. And so about a month after this bill was signed into law, Greenwood Village said, we're indemnifying right now. We're going to be proactive. We're not going to wait for it to say whether or not we're going to indemnify. So the Democrats are going to go back and say you can't do that, and which I think is a shame because law enforcement needs to know that they're going to be protected. But there's going to be some other changes. I'm going to work on some changes because there's really no due process for officers that are accused of something, and they can have their license taken away, their post certificate taken away by the state, and with no due process. And there's a thing called a Brady letter, and which is if you get a Brady jacket, it means you can't ever testify because the DA will never call you because it says the officer might have lied in an internal investigation or in a report, but there's no due process on that. A DA can do it as a whim, and there's no standardized process. And I don't want bad cops out there, but I think, if we're going to give criminals due process, we need to give law enforcement officers the same due process that we afford criminals. So we're going to be working on some of that.
We've been talking largely about what's happened in Colorado because that's what you have been working on. If you were giving some advice to people in North Carolina or other states about how to move forward with this, I suspect maybe one of the first things you would say is make sure law enforcement, attorneys, the people who actually have to deal with this are part of the process.
Absolutely, because that did not happen in Colorado. It was they came up with the bill. As a matter of fact, we didn't even see the bill until it got introduced, and then as soon as it got introduced, it was sent to committee. So we didn't even see the bill, had no idea what was in it until literally about an hour or two before we had to go to committee. And so, yes, work with the professionals, work with them, get their buy-in, and the other thing is don't rush it. We rammed this through in like I said, it's 40 pages. We rammed it through in literally in about a week and a half, and at the end of session. So start early is what I would suggest to the legislature. Start early if you're looking at something like this, and work out all the bugs so that way you don't have to come back the next year and clean it up. And like you said, get the buy-in of the professionals.